Hello, everyone. I wanted to share some thoughts on what a civil war in our time might look like and how it might play out. I'm doing this to promote my new book. It's called Against Us: The Fall of America. It's available on Kindle. I also made this because I have a unique perspective you will want to hear. If you think I'm wrong, let me know in the comments, but please do me the favor of listening to the entire video first. So, as I said, I have a unique prediction, and although there's some great videos out there on this, I haven't seen one that's really nailed it. It just isn't as simple and straightforward as it's been portrayed. The following analysis informed my book, which you can find a link to in the description of this video. Now, the country could fracture a few different ways. During the Civil War, you could see some balkanization. That means our society breaks down into ethnic and religious enclaves like Mormons, Greek Orthodox Americans, street gangs transformed into warlords, Latin Americans, or other immigrants. Think of the famous rooftop Koreans. They sort of have their own territory, and you don't want to wander in there, or at least you're going to be very polite when you do. But the big division that has the potential to turn violent on a mass scale is rooted in political divisions. So we're going to run through major factors and then we'll touch on the others, the wild cards. All right, so number one, military factor. The military used to be majority conservative since about the 80s or so, after the military was transformed into a professional force, but that's declined in the past decade. Enlisted U.S. military personnel are about half Republican, the rest are a mix of independents and Democrats. According to one poll, half dislike Trump, for example. Other polls put Biden as the recipient of a slight majority, very slight. However, U.S. military officers are almost all Republicans or at least lean conservative. I've known a few, and yeah, they all despise both Democrats and libertarians. There's exceptions, but overwhelmingly this is the case. One study put conservatives to liberals among U.S. military officers had a ratio of 8 to 1. The implications of this are that although something like an even split in the enlisted is possible, the Republicans can use their massive numerical advantage in officers and continue to build their army, while the Democrats' fighting force is more limited in leadership and training of new recruits. A liberal military would find it more challenging to train more troops of matching quality to the ideologically conservative forces. And as far as leadership goes, like battlefield leadership, this is a decisive advantage for the right. Leadership is crucial in war. Look at a conflict like the Spanish Civil War or, the 19th century American Civil War. And this was one of the most important factors that really decided the outcome in both. The story of the First Civil War is basically the Union failing until they installed quality leaders who were determined and capable enough to finish the job. Okay, for number two, we've got geography and demographics. I've lumped these together because they're intimately related. Basically, as you'd expect, the liberals get the cities, the conservatives get the countryside and small towns. This is true in almost every state, even the most liberal states like California and Illinois. The suburbs are more complex, but I'm going to guess that more often they will lean slightly right, simply because they'll assume that a leftist occupation will be more controlling and restrictive than a right one. In many places, these suburban areas are contested, with both sides struggling to control them or at least gain their support or acquiescence. In most states and regions, there's a pretty healthy balance of party allegiance. Neither has a huge advantage. So you see a lot of checkpoints, a lot of voting wards, the edges of towns, and even block to block divisions with neighborhood patrols as nascent militias. And I expect those to be slowly won by the conservative faction through intense light infantry battles fighting block to block and house to house. but not so on the West Coast. Democrats outnumber Republicans there by about 3-1. Not only that, but the average Republican there is over the age of 55. So these stats wouldn't bode well for a locally sourced conservative military force. I just haven't come across any videos online discussing these demographic facts, but they're vitally important to understanding the situation on the ground. All right, those are the big ones. Let's move to the other factors. International support, that would be a big deal. This would sustain the West Coast because Russia and China would pour support into their forces simply to prolong the conflict. They want to knock out the big dog, their enemy, the USA. Almost everyone else would support the conservatives who took over the Midwest, South, and East because they just assumed they'd win. Mexico and Canada wouldn't risk provoking them since they'll be sharing a border with that winning side. Europe wouldn't risk losing such a military ally either. They can't really do anything right. Okay, let's get to economics other than just food, industrial production, and maintenance of equipment. Obviously, this is vital to keep a war machine functioning. This would give whoever controls the area stretching from lower New England across the mid Atlantic states, the Midwest, and parts of the South the advantage. That's where most industry is in the USA. And in the end, one faction will take them all. There's no massive natural barrier to stop one faction or alliance of factions from eventually claiming all of it. Willingness to give their lives is another wild card. I would be inclined to say this goes to the conservatives, since religion helps with this a lot. But I would also counter that the liberals on the West Coast would not want to bow to outsiders at basically any cost. This is close to a tie, but perhaps a slight edge for the right. Technological innovation would probably belong to the West Coast. There they have an edge simply because they have Silicon Valley to draw upon for ideas. So they'd have plenty of drones, innovative surveillance techniques, and so on. Another issue that's always brought up is firearms ownership. So I'm going to address that. I'm not saying that it doesn't matter. I'm a big 2A supporter myself, but my view is that civilian ownership prior to the conflict breaking out is only decisive in a brief war. If the conflict drags out, people without firearms will find a way to get them. I think a good example of this is Ireland prior to the Troubles. Nearly all legally held firearms were in the hands of the pro-UK Protestant Unionist and Loyalist community. It wasn't on par with the US at all, but there was and is a bit of a gun culture there compared to England. And the IRA found itself completely disarmed when the Troubles began, which a lot of people don't know. Yet within a few years, the IRA were equipped with better rifles, the more tactical AR-15 and the Russian-made AK-47, while British soldiers were still lugging around unwieldy battle rifles while performing raids and house-to-house searches. And aside from that, we've seen a dramatic rise in firearms ownership among demographics who previously were reluctant to buy firearms and probably wouldn't be conservative if push came to shove in the Civil War scenario. So it's actually hard to judge that question anyway. And it really doesn't take long to train someone in basic proficiency with a rifle. I've seen it happen with complete novices in several different jobs that I've worked in. Okay, and now to the war. So at first the war is probably a mix of violent protests and occasional assassinations. And arguably we're already at that stage. With enough catalysts, it develops from there into a more sustained yet still irregular scope of warfare, such as paramilitaries, death squads, and assassinations, which eventually culminate in larger raids, something like Bleeding Kansas was in the run up to the Civil War. But under this situation, I could see there not being the will on any side to repress the violence. At least that's sort of the pattern for a few years now. So I'm picturing this violence continuing to escalate into full blown open warfare. Something like refusing to accept the outcome of the election, with both sides claiming victory, makes it impossible for the military to stay neutral, and they're forced to pick sides. And de facto, conditions of war already exist on the streets, so if you're a soldier, you need to decide quickly. Despite starting out with roughly equal numbers, and let's just say, for the sake of simplicity, relatively equal amounts of equipment, the conservatives begin winning in most of the states east of the Rockies. They use their superior numbers of trained and experienced officers to outfight the Democrats tactically in military engagements. More importantly, the Republican conservative command develops a better strategy, which is to sever urban areas, keep them separated from their rural sources of food. It would be more difficult for the urban centric liberals to acquire more farmland than it would be for the rural right to deny it to them. After all, almost any conflict occurring near a farm is going to disrupt the harvesting and transport of crops, no matter who is winning, while the right has their own food sources further removed from the urban based army's reach. So they continue to press this advantage and continue to cut the cities off from the surrounding countryside. The campaign over time gets easier for the right and more challenging to the left until they finally suffer military catastrophe, probably at least partially through hunger and starvation. This is what would be happening in almost every state east of the left coast or east of the Rockies, however you want to kind of describe that. California, Oregon, and Washington, however, are a different story. Along the West Coast states, we see liberals using their overwhelming advantage in numbers within that region to take over their cities' adjacent agricultural zones. I'm aware that rural West Coast states are as conservative as any other region out in the countryside, but they're vastly outnumbered and short on allies. There isn't a nearby conservative military force capable of stopping the city people, so they have time to plod along slowly and get their act together. Then naturally they began pushing east, mostly winning, even if winning is through attrition. How far they get exactly is hard to say, but I'm going to guess that between a fourth to a third of the conterminous U.S. is under their sway. It could be a little less or more, but it's still a big chunk of land. Plenty of it is arable. The Rocky Mountains are difficult for any army to control. I think that's putting it mildly. You've basically got to win over the locals. Those people could hold out against any military invader for as long as they chose, if they have the will to do so. So that brings us to the conclusion, and I am predicting a stalemate. I have lived in many regions of the USA, and the West Coast is simply a different place. The West Coast would conquer a vast stretch of the mountainous West. Not all of it, but enough, and they would easily hold on to what they won by using their vast numbers to defend strategically vital areas at narrow mountain passes and other choke points, and yet retain enough personnel to project at least some power outside their own zone. Were it not for the huge mountain ranges, sure, the conservatives would easily sweep through and soundly defeat them, but they do have to contend with those mountains. It's not just the difficulty of conquering them, it's maintaining supply lines through them. Squads of West Coast forces operating throughout those mountain chains would sever any invading force's supplies, no matter how much better their army was. If you doubt me, read up on Yugoslavia and World War II. The left coast would be like a hippie androgynous version of Yugoslavia. And as you probably know, the Nazis ended up trying to negotiate with those people in Yugoslavia. They couldn't just completely crush them. And so I predict this conflict would end with America de facto broken into two pieces. Both sides of the mountainous West are winner-take-all affairs, with conservatives gobbling up the East and the liberals and West Coast absorbing some of the mountainous West. We would see peace talks to reunite. U.S. allies would broker negotiations, but hostile international forces would push for further conflict to keep America off the international stage. So no one really wins. In the East, terrorism persists for years. In the West, pockets of American loyalists fight guerrilla wars for generations. It would just take centuries to recover if we ever did. Or maybe I'm wrong. I'd love to hear your feedback, and thank you for watching.